I'm Professor Stephen Bainbridge, and here on YouTube, I've got a channel that uh, discusses corporate governance, corporate law, and related issues. And today, I'd like to talk to you about ESG. ESG stands for Environmental, Social, and Governance, and it's one of today's hottest buzzwords in both investing and corporate governance. But it's used to mean a number of different things. Some folks use the term stakeholder capitalism, corporate social responsibility, and ESG interchangeably. But corporate social responsibility and ESG are broader concepts that embrace entities and causes beyond our definition of stakeholders. Specifically, corporate social responsibility and ESG speak to issues and causes relating to society as a whole, the environment, inequalities of wealth, and a host of other social ills, as well as the interests of a company's stakeholders and its shareholders. Now, some investors use ESG metrics to supplement traditional financial metrics when they evaluate companies. And some companies purport to use ESG to measure the performance of their executives. But while there's a lot of talk about ESG, are companies walking the ESG walk? Now, at the outset, I want to deal with a couple of misconceptions. The first of which is that the traditional concept of the purpose of a corporation, which was shareholder value maximization, is somehow bad for the economy, bad for the environment, bad for people. And I think this New Yorker cartoon nicely captures this misconception. But it's fundamentally wrong to assume that there's some inconsistency between shareholder value maximization and concern for stakeholders, society, the environment, and so on. Shareholder value maximization does not encourage directors and officers of a company to treat stakeholders as mere automatons whose knowledge, expertise, and feelings are irrelevant. It doesn't encourage them to dump pollution into the environment and to externalize the costs of doing business out onto society at large. To the contrary, shareholder value maximization, in 90+% of the cases, encourages managers to treat employees and other stakeholders and the environment with consideration, precisely because that's usually also the best way of maximizing shareholder value. The critical point to remember, however, is that in today's marketplace, the concern for stakeholders, concern for ESG factors, is typically a means to the end of maximizing shareholder value rather than an end in and of itself. And that's admittedly a somewhat controversial claim, but I think by the end of this film, you'll agree with me. A second misconception is that ESG is easy to implement. Now, shareholder value maximization is easy to implement. Shareholder value maximization provides a quantifiable metric by which to assess whether directors and officers have used their authority to run the company in a way that's responsible, or in a way that's careless, or even in a way that's selfish. It requires one to ask very simple questions, like, is the return on investment capital greater than our weighted average cost of capital? Is the company profitable? Are its profits increasing? Is the share price going up? Are new customers being obtained on a profitable basis? Now, by the way, let's say a word about the meaning of that term profits. A common error that's made by ESG proponents is to assume that the profits to which these questions relate are historical earnings. Properly understood, however, value maximization looks to the future. Maximizing a value is really a way of describing the process of maximizing the present discounted value of the firm's future earnings. And that's important because it means that the corporation has to be run on a sustainable basis. A corporation that treats its stakeholders and the environment badly is not a corporation that's going to be able to generate value in the future for its shareholders. In any event, contrast the relatively simple metrics associated with shareholder value maximization to the much more complicated metrics that are involved in implementing ESG. This is a fairly standard list of ESG-based metrics. And in total, the authors identified no less than 79 different metrics, many of which are in direct competition with each other. How many maximans would you as a manager want to have to try to maximize simultaneously? 1 or 79? And that's an inescapable problem. Even win-win situations where your decision as a manager is going to increase the size of the pie require a decision-making norm. The expanded pie must still be divided. And logically, it's not possible to maximize in more than one dimension at the same time. The name for this problem is the double maximan. The aim is to maximize two aims, despite there being an inevitable trade-off between them. Now, a popular way that people use to try and solve this problem is to say, well, we're going to balance all of these metrics. We're going to take these 79 metrics and balance them against each other. Now, balance, of course, can be a good thing. But balance can also be a plausible excuse for missing the point. Suppose somebody told you to run as fast as possible. Well, you'd be left wondering whether you should jog for 26 miles, or sprint for 100 meters, or compromise between the two. That kind of vague balance all of these factors leaves you with enormous freedom and discretion. And maybe what you decided is that you ought to lie in the grass and count the birds as they fly by. And if somebody asked you how come you're doing that, you could explain that you were striving to achieve a balance. Extending the analogy to the corporate context, directors who are authorized to try and balance 79 maximans are essentially being authorized to do the corporate equivalent of lying in the grass and counting birds. Directors who are subject to accountability for 79 concerns can always justify a decision by saying, well, I realize that this decision was not popular with the shareholders, but it was essential that we maximize ESG factors 1, 13, 39, and 78. Conversely, they could also say something like, well, yes, we realize that we're having a negative impact on ESG metrics 25, 31, and 37, but we felt it was necessary in order to produce value for the shareholders. The problem is that directors who are accountable to everybody are accountable to no one, and that they can use balancing competing metrics to justify self-interested decisions. They just pick the metrics that maximize whatever it is that they value. And then they justify that decision by saying, no, 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 it's not about what we value. It's about ESG factors 13, 36, 41, and 49. In other words, ESG presents accountability concerns, agency costs, in a way that shareholder value maximization simply doesn't. And so we probably don't want companies maximizing ESG rather than maximizing shareholder value. Well, however you come down on that issue, it seems to me that the evidence suggests that companies are not walking the ESG walk. Lucian Bebchuk and some co-authors did a study of 100 acquisitions of public corporations, where the acquisition was valued at $1 billion or more during the pandemic. And they looked at the merger agreements in those deals, and none of them, not one, contained any protections for ESG considerations. Another study looked at firms whose CEOs signed the 2019 Business Roundtable corporate purpose statement. You might have heard about this. The Business Roundtable is an organization of 200 CEOs of large corporations. And traditionally, they had periodically issued statements of what constitutes good corporate governance. And part of that was a statement about what the purpose of the corporation is. And traditionally, the Business Roundtable had taken the position that the purpose of a corporation is shareholder value maximization. In 2019, the BRT got a lot of press because they issued a new corporate purpose statement that embraced ESG, corporate social responsibility, stakeholder capitalism. Now, you'd think that if those CEOs and their companies really cared all that much about ESG considerations, as they claimed, that these would be companies that are run in a very ethical way. Well, the study found that, in fact, those companies that signed the statement had a higher incidence of federal regulatory compliance violations than the companies whose CEOs had not signed the statement. Now, companies are required by stock exchange listing standards to have a stated written set of corporate governance guidelines. And almost all of these guidelines include a statement of, what the corporation's purpose is. And most of these statements are sort of anodyne. They're platitudes of the sort that you see in a typical mission statement. But they all say something along the lines of, our purpose is to sustainably generate long-term value for our shareholders. Now, you would think that if ESG considerations were now suddenly being embraced by the corporate world, and in particular were being embraced by the CEOs who signed that pro-ESG BRT statement, that they would be modifying their corporate governance guidelines to embrace explicitly ESG and corporate social responsibility and stakeholder capitalism. But none of them did. Not a single one amended their corporate governance guidelines. Well, is ESG being used to assess corporate performance by boards of directors, for example? And the answer to that is no, not really. A useful study of this was done again by Lucian Bebchuk and some co-authors, who looked at the CEO compensation during the pandemic at S&P 100 companies. The CEOs of 62 of the companies in their survey had signed the 2019 Business Roundtable statement. But 26 of those companies, almost half, used no ESG-based metrics in setting CEO pay. Now, many companies admittedly do use ESG metrics in setting bonus compensation. But bonuses are typically only about 20-odd%, 21.5 on average, percent of total CEO pay. So almost 80% of CEO pay is being determined solely on the basis of stock performance and financial metrics, not ESG metrics. And while it's true that many companies are using ESG factors in setting their CEOs' bonuses, those metrics are typically given very little weight. Typically, in deciding how much of a bonus to pay the CEO, ESG metrics account for 2 to 3% of the total package. In other words, yeah, some companies are using ESG considerations in setting their CEO's pay. But that percentage that is dependent on ESG performance is trivial. And if we assume that pay is the primary motivator for how CEOs are going to behave, the sort of rampant talk of stakeholder capitalism and ESG-friendly policies that's coming from companies like those in the Business Roundtable really needs to be taken with more than just a grain of salt. In other words, I think most of this is talk rather than commitment. And I'll give you a good case study that I think demonstrates this. Of course, we lawyers like to kind of say that the plural of anecdote is data. But nevertheless, anecdotes can be instructive. And I think the story of what happened at Etsy is very instructive. In 2015, Etsy went public, and they went public as what's known as a certified B Corp, which meant that they had been assessed by a third-party evaluator as being sort of a ESG-friendly company. And they were allegedly committed to stakeholder capitalism and corporate social responsibility and ESG. 2 years later, a small activist hedge fund called Black and White Capital took a small stake in Etsy and announced that they intended to encourage Etsy to focus more intently on maximizing shareholder value. And shortly thereafter, 2 more hedge companies took positions in Etsy stock and announced similar plans. And this is a not at all uncommon situation. Etsy's board faced a situation that many companies have faced, where hedge funds come in, having identified a company that they believe is underperforming on the stock price. This is not about their ESG performance. This was exclusively about Etsy's stock price performance. And the hedge funds want to make changes that are designed to increase shareholder value in the near term. Well, what should Etsy's board have done? Well, whatever they should have done, they capitulated. The dealbreaker.com website, in reporting on this story, I think put it harshly but truly, that Etsy flipped from being a crunchy hipster company to being Gordon Gekko in one afternoon. Some of my younger viewers may not remember Gordon Gekko. He was the villain in Oliver Stone's movie Wall Street, and his famous line was, "Greed is good." Etsy's board fired the incumbent CEO, cut the workforce, gave up its B Corp certification. The new CEO came in and focused on profit rather than ESG. The stock price jumped. And today, ESG is just a regular old for-profit business corporation with no more ESG factors than anybody else. And although that's a high-profile story, it's not an uncommon one. Put simply, whatever companies are saying about their ESG performance, there's an awful lot of greenwashing going on out there. Whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, you need to be aware of it. Thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, like and subscribe below.